The year is 449 AD. A dying king lies on his deathbed, his kingdom crumbling under the weight of barbarian raids. In desperation, he makes a choice that will change the course of history forever. He invites the wolves into his home. "Send word to the Saxon lands," whispers King Vortigern of Britain, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "Tell them we offer gold, land, anything. Just make them come." Little did he know, he had just opened the door to one of history's greatest migrations, a tide of warriors, farmers, and dreamers who would reshape an entire civilization. This is the story of the Saxons, a people who emerged from the misty forests of northern Europe to become the backbone of what we now call England. Tonight, we journey through 12 centuries of triumph and tragedy, of kingdoms rising and falling, like waves upon an ancient shore. Close your eyes and let the epic unfold. In the cold, unforgiving lands of what we now call northern Germany and Denmark, where the North Sea crashes against windswept shores, a people were forging their destiny. The Saxons, their very name striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. The word Saxon comes from their weapon of choice, the seax, a single-edged knife that could split a man's skull or carve a child's wooden toy with equal precision. These were not merely warriors. They were survivors in a world that showed no mercy to the weak. Picture vast forests stretching endlessly toward gray horizons, where ancient oaks whispered secrets older than Rome itself. In clearings carved from the wilderness, Saxon villages hummed with life, the ring of hammers on anvils, the lowing of cattle, the laughter of children playing with wooden swords, all the sounds of a people making their mark on the world. But life here was harsh. The soil was often poor, the winters brutal, and neighboring tribes constantly pressed for land and resources. A Saxon warrior named Hengest once said to his brother Horsa, as they gazed across their frost-covered fields, "Brother, we are like wolves in a cage that grows smaller each day. Soon we must choose, starve or break free." The Saxons organized themselves into tribes, each led by a war chief whose word was law. These leaders weren't chosen for their noble blood, but for their strength, cunning, and ability to keep their people alive. In their great halls built of oak and iron, warriors would gather around roaring fires, sharing mead and planning their next move. Their gods reflected their harsh world. Woden, the one-eyed wanderer who traded knowledge for wisdom. Thunor, the thunder god who battled giants with his mighty hammer. Tiw, the god of war who sacrificed his hand to bind the great wolf Fenrir. These deities demanded courage, honor, and the strength to face whatever fate the Norns had woven. Saxon women, too, were forces to be reckoned with. They could own land, demand divorces, and some even fought alongside their men in battle. A Saxon saying went, "A man without a strong woman is like a ship without an anchor. He may sail far, but he'll never find home." The early Saxons were master craftsmen. Their metalwork was legendary, their jewelry intricate, and their ships were works of art. Long, sleek vessels that could navigate both river and sea, carrying warriors to distant shores or merchants to profitable markets. But by the 4th century AD, pressure was mounting. The Huns, sweeping westward under their terrible leader Attila, pushed other Germanic tribes into Saxon territory. The Romans, though weakening, still demanded tribute and tried to play the tribes against each other, and the land itself seemed to whisper that change was coming. Saxon seers, wise women who could read the signs in bird flight and cloud formations, began speaking of visions. "I see ships," one ancient seer told her chief. "Ships filled with our people, sailing toward a green land beyond the sea. I see new kingdoms rising where none stood before." The chief laughed. "Old woman, you dream of impossible things." But the seeds of destiny were already planted. The invitation that changed everything came from across the dark waters of the North Sea. Britain, that mysterious green island the Romans had abandoned, was calling for help. Vortigern, the self-proclaimed High King of the Britons, faced a crisis that would have broken lesser men. The Picts from the north raided constantly, burning villages and carrying off slaves. The Irish pirates struck from the west. and his own nobles plotted against him in shadowed corners of his court. "My lord," his advisor whispered urgently, "the Pict warbands grow bolder. Yesterday they reached the walls of Eboracum itself. We must act, or lose everything." Vortigern stared out at the gray sea from his fortress at Dinas Emrys. The Romans had left, taking their legions and their protection with them. The Britons, grown soft under Roman rule, struggled to defend themselves. "What would you have me do?" Vortigern asked, his voice heavy with the weight of kingship. "Our warriors are too few, our enemies too many." It was then that a merchant, just returned from the Saxon lands, spoke up. "My lord, across the sea live warriors the likes of which the world has never seen. They call themselves Saxons, and they fear neither man nor devil. Hire them as federati, federated troops, and your enemies will flee like sheep before wolves." The idea was not new. Romans had used barbarian mercenaries for centuries, but Vortigern's invitation would unleash forces beyond his imagining. The message reached Hengist and Horsa, two Saxon brothers whose names would echo through history. They ruled a confederation of tribes pressed hard by enemies on all sides. When Vortigern's offer arrived, land, gold, and the promise of more to come, it seemed like an answer to prayers. "Brothers," Hengist called to his war council, his voice ringing through the great hall. "Across the western sea lies an island green as emerald, rich as dreams, and weakly defended. A British king offers us gold to do what we do best, fight. But why settle for gold when we might take kingdoms?" Horsa, ever the cautious brother, frowned. "And if it's a trap? If we sail into Saxon bane?" Hengist's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Then we die as Saxons should, with swords in our hands, and songs on our lips. But if we succeed," he gestured toward the misty horizon, "if we succeed, our children's children will call us the fathers of a new nation." The decision was made. In the spring of 449 AD, 3 ships, just 3, cut through the gray waters toward Britain. On board were perhaps 200 Saxon warriors, their families, their hopes, and their iron will. The ships were masterpieces of Saxon craftsmanship. The lead vessel bore a dragon's head carved with such skill it seemed ready to breathe fire. Its sides were painted in bright reds and golds, and shields hung along the gunwales like scales on some great sea serpent. As the mist parted to reveal the white cliffs of Kent, a young Saxon warrior named Iesk, Hengist's son, whispered to his father, "It's beautiful, father, like the halls of the gods." "Aye, boy," Hengist replied, his hand resting on his sword hilt, "and it will be ours." The meeting between Vortigern and the Saxon brothers took place on the beach at Ebbsfleet, in Kent. The British king, resplendent in purple and gold, waited with a small retinue. The Saxons came in full war gear, mail shirts gleaming, spears bristling, shields bright with fresh paint. "Welcome, Hengist of the Saxons," Vortigern said, his voice carrying across the shingle. "I have heard of your people's prowess in war." Hengist stepped forward, every inch the warrior king. "And I have heard of your need, Vortigern of the Britons. We are here to make strong your weak places." The treaty they signed that day seemed simple enough. The Saxons would receive the Isle of Thanet as their base, regular payments of food and gold, and the right to bring their families across the sea. In return, they would fight Vortigern's enemies, primarily the Picts. The first campaign was a stunning success. Saxon warriors, fighting in their traditional wedge formation, crashed into Pictish warbands like a thunderbolt. The enemy, accustomed to fighting Roman-trained Britons, had never faced anything like these northern berserkers. "They fight like devils," one captured Pict told his interrogators. "They howl war songs as they kill, and their eyes burn with battle fury. We cannot stand against them." Word of Saxon victories spread across both Britain and the continent. Soon, more ships were arriving, Angles from Denmark, Jutes from the Northlands, and more Saxons from the German coast. What had begun as a small, mercenary band was becoming a migration. Vortigern should have been alarmed, but success had made him complacent. Besides, he had fallen under the spell of Hengist's daughter, Rowena, whose beauty was said to rival that of Helen of Troy. At the feast where Vortigern first saw Rowena, She approached him with a golden cup filled with mead. "Ways hail, Lord King," she said, using the Saxon greeting. "Be whole." Vortigern, bewitched by her grace and beauty, replied in broken Saxon, "Drink hail. I drink to your health." The marriage alliance that followed would give Hengist even more influence over the British king. But it also sealed Vortigern's fate, for his own nobles began to see him as a traitor to his people. More concerning was the endless stream of Saxon settlers. They came not just as warriors now, but as farmers, craftsmen, and families seeking new homes. The Isle of Thanet could no longer contain them, and they began spreading into Kent proper. "You promised us land," Hengist reminded Vortigern when the king expressed concern. "We have kept our bargain, now you must keep yours." But some Britons were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. A young priest named Gildas wrote in his chronicle, "They came as our protectors, but who will protect us from our protectors?" The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. The great feast at Amesbury was meant to be a celebration of peace between Britons and Saxons. Instead, it became one of history's most infamous betrayals, a night when trust died and war was born. By 455 AD, tensions between the settled Saxons and their British hosts had reached a breaking point. What had begun as a simple mercenary arrangement had evolved into something far more complex. Saxon settlements dotted the eastern shores of Britain like seeds planted in foreign soil. Vortigern, now older and wearier, found himself caught between increasingly angry British nobles and increasingly demanding Saxon allies. His own son, Vortimer, had begun openly opposing his father's policies. "Father," Vortimer pleaded during one heated council meeting, "can you not see what's happening? Every month more Saxon ships arrive. They speak of Kent as if it belongs to them, not us. Soon they will outnumber us in our own land." Vortigern's weathered face showed the strain of years of difficult decisions. "They have kept their bargains, my son. Without Saxon spears, the Picts would have burned London itself. And now? Now we may trade Pictish wolves for Saxon ones." The king's British advisors murmured agreement, but Vortigern held firm. He had made his choice years ago, and British pride would not let him admit error. Hengist, meanwhile, faced pressures of his own. More Saxon tribes were arriving monthly, and they needed land. Good farming land, not just the marshy territories they'd been granted. His war chiefs grew restless. "How long must we pretend to be guests in this land?" demanded Octa, Hengist's nephew, during a private council. "Our swords won them their victories. Our courage saved their cities. Why should we not take what we've earned?" Hengist, ever the diplomat among his own people, counseled patience. "The Britons still outnumber us greatly. We must be wise as serpents, strong as lions." But patience was wearing thin on both sides. The breaking point came when Vortigern, under pressure from his nobles, announced that no more Saxon settlers would be allowed to land in Britain. Worse, he began reducing the grain payments that fed Saxon families. Hengist requested an urgent meeting. "Lord Vortigern," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "my people grow hungry. The children cry at night. You promised us sustenance in exchange for our service." "And you have been fed," Vortigern replied, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "But my own people complain that Saxon appetites are endless." "Then let us feast together one final time," Hengist suggested. "Let British and Saxon nobles break bread in fellowship. Perhaps we can find a path that serves us all." The feast was set for the ancient stone circle at Amesbury, a place sacred to both peoples. Each side would bring 300 unarmed nobles to demonstrate their peaceful intentions. It seemed like wisdom, two communities coming together to solve their differences through words rather than steel. The evening began beautifully. Spring flowers carpeted the ancient site, and the setting sun painted the massive stones in shades of gold and crimson. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and barrels of finest ale. British harpers played alongside Saxon skalds, their melodies weaving together like the friendship all hoped to rebuild. Vortigern sat at the high table with Hengist, both men smiling and raising toasts to eternal peace. British and Saxon nobles mingled freely, sharing stories of their homelands, their families, their hopes for the future. "To peace between our peoples," Vortigern declared, raising his cup. "To peace," the assembly echoed, British and Saxon voices, joining as one. But as the evening wore on and the ale flowed freely, some Saxons began touching the long knives hidden beneath their cloaks. For Hengist had given a secret signal to his men before the feast. "When I call for brotherhood, that will be your sign." The moment came near midnight. Hengist rose from his seat, swaying slightly from drink, and called out in a voice that carried across the circle, "My friends, my British brothers, let us pledge eternal brotherhood. Nemed your seax," he shouted in Saxon. "Draw your knives." To the drunken Britons it sounded like another toast. To the Saxons, it was the signal they'd been waiting for. What happened next was slaughter. Saxon knives flashed in the firelight as 300 British nobles found death instead of friendship. The sacred stones ran red with blood as screams echoed across the ancient site. Some Britons tried to fight with dining knives and broken cups, but they had come in peace and were utterly unprepared. Vortigern himself was spared, but only to witness the horror of his naivety. Hengest's strong hands gripped the king's shoulders as he forced him to watch his nobles die. "This is what happens to those who break faith with the Saxons," Hengest hissed. "You would starve our children. You would make beggars of warriors who saved your kingdom." The massacre at Amesbury sent shockwaves across Britain. Survivors who fled into the night carried word of Saxon treachery to every corner of the island. British resistance, which had been fragmented and uncertain, suddenly found focus and fury. But the immediate result was Saxon domination. With most of their leading men dead, many British communities simply surrendered. Hengest's forces swept across Kent, Essex, and Sussex, establishing Saxon kingdoms that would endure for centuries. A young British warrior named Arthur, though not yet the legend he would become, reportedly wept when news of the massacre reached him. "They came as friends and left as conquerors," he told his companions. "But this betrayal will be their downfall. For now, all Britons will know the Saxon heart." The age of conquest had begun. From the ashes of Amesbury rose a resistance that would become legend. As Saxon kingdoms spread across eastern Britain like fire across dry grass, from the western hills came a response that would echo through the ages: the time of Arthur. We know little for certain about this Arthur, this war leader, who became myth. Perhaps he was a Romano-British nobleman, perhaps a military commander trained in the old Roman ways. What we know is this: when Britain's darkest hour arrived, someone answered the call. The Saxons, emboldened by their victories, pushed deeper into British lands. Hengest's son Aesk established himself as King of Kent, while other Saxon warbands carved out territories in what would become Wessex, Essex, and Sussex. Their confidence seemed justified. After all, hadn't they crushed organized British resistance in a single night? But Britain is an old land with deep roots, and those roots were stirring. The call to arms came from an unexpected source. At Caerleon, the old Roman fortress town in Wales, a war council gathered unlike any seen before. British kings who had spent generations feuding with each other sat side by side. Roman-trained cavalry officers shared tables with Celtic druids. Christian bishops blessed swords alongside prayers to older gods. At their head sat Arthur, young, determined, carrying a sword some claimed was forged in the other world itself. "Brothers," his voice rang clear in the great hall, "we have seen what happens when we stand divided. At Amesbury our finest fell because they trusted in Saxon honor. But dishonor carries the seeds of its own defeat. A grizzled British king named Cador of Cornwall stood. Fine words, young war leader, but the Saxons have iron weapons, trained warriors, and victory in their hearts. What have we?" Arthur's smile was grim but determined. "We have what they lack: knowledge of this land, the support of its people, and the fury of those who fight to protect their homes rather than seize others." The strategy Arthur proposed was revolutionary. Instead of meeting Saxon armies in open battle, where their superior discipline and equipment gave them advantage, British forces would strike fast and disappear, hit supply lines and isolated settlements, make the Saxons pay for every mile they took. "We will be like wolves in winter," Arthur declared. "They may have the strength of the bear, but we have the cunning of those who know every stone and stream." The first major clash came at Mount Badon, a hill fortress whose exact location history has forgotten, but whose importance was undeniable. Saxon forces under AIS had besieged a British stronghold, confident of another easy victory. Instead, they found themselves facing something new: British cavalry fighting in disciplined formations, using tactics learned from Roman manuals but adapted to British terrain. Arthur himself led the charge, his white horse Lamre flying across the battlefield like sea foam before a storm. "For Britain," his battle cry echoed across the field. "For our children yet unborn." The battle raged from dawn to dusk. Saxon shield walls, seemingly unbreakable, found themselves torn apart by cavalry charges that hit from unexpected angles. British archers, hidden among rocks and trees, sent flights of arrows into Saxon flanks. And when the Saxons tried to retreat, they found their routes blocked by British warbands who knew every sheep path and hidden valley. By sunset, Saxon power in central Britain lay shattered. Aesch himself barely escaped with his life, carrying word back to Saxon settlements that the Britons had found their war leader. The victory at Badon marked the beginning of what later chroniclers would call Arthur's Golden Peace. Roughly 50 years when Saxon expansion was halted and pushed back. During this time, something remarkable happened. Britain began to remember what it meant to be British. Trade routes reopened between communities that had been isolated since the Roman withdrawal. British craftsmen, no longer hiding their skills from Saxon raiders, produced works of art that rivaled anything made in Constantinople or Rome. Monasteries became centers of learning where Christian monks preserved classical texts alongside Celtic poetry and Saxon runes. For some Saxons, too, had grown weary of constant warfare. But perhaps most importantly, the resistance gave birth to stories that would outlive the kingdoms themselves. Around evening fires in British halls, bards sang of Arthur and his companions, of Gawain the golden-tongued, of Lancelot the knight of the cart, of Merlin the wise, and of Guinevere whose beauty could launch not ships but songs. These stories grew in the telling as stories do. What began as chronicles of real battles became tales of magic swords and quests for holy grails. But at their heart lay a truth more enduring than any historical fact: the belief that when darkness falls, heroes rise. The Saxon response to Badon was predictable. They regrouped, planned, and prepared for renewed warfare. But something had changed in the Saxon heart as well. Living in British lands, surrounded by British people, marrying British wives and raising British-born children, many Saxons began to see themselves not as conquerors, but as settlers. Cerdic, founder of the West Saxon Kingdom, reportedly told his war chiefs, "We came to this land as wolves, but our cubs are learning to tend sheep. Perhaps it's time we learned as well." This shift in Saxon thinking would prove crucial in years to come. For when Arthur finally fell, as all heroes must, the Saxons who replaced him were no longer the same people who had perpetrated the Amesbury massacre. They had become, in ways their ancestors never intended, British themselves. From the marriage of Saxon warrior culture and Christian scholarship emerged one of history's most unexpected golden ages. In monasteries scattered across the English landscape, Saxon monks were creating works of art and learning that would be treasured for 1,000 years. The transformation began in the most unlikely place, the windswept island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria. Here, Irish monks had established a monastery that would become the jewel of European scholarship, but it was Saxon hands that would craft its greatest treasure. Brother Edfrith, a Saxon monk whose calligraphy was said to rival the angels themselves, labored for years on a single book, the Lindisfarne Gospels. Working by candlelight in his cold scriptorium, he created illuminated pages that seemed to glow with inner fire. Saxon interlace patterns danced around Latin text, creating a harmony between Germanic art and Christian faith that had never been seen before. "Each letter is a prayer," Edfrith told his fellow monks. "Each page, A sermon in gold and crimson. The Lindisfarne Gospels were more than beautiful. They were revolutionary. Here was proof that Saxon culture could create works to rival anything, produced in Rome or Constantinople. The Germanic peoples, once dismissed as barbarians, had become custodians of civilization itself. But Lindisfarne was just the beginning. Across England, Saxon monasteries became centers of learning that drew scholars from across Europe. At Jarrow and Wearmouth, twin monasteries in Northumbria, a young Saxon monk named Bede was writing works that would reshape how people understood history itself. Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People was the first work to use what we now call Anno Domini dating, years measured from Christ's birth. But more than that, it presented a vision of the Saxons not as conquerors or invaders, but as God's chosen instruments for bringing Christianity to Britain. The Saxons came not as destroyers, but as builders, Bede wrote. What seemed like conquest was actually providence, preparing this island to become a beacon of faith to all nations. This was Saxon identity transformed. No longer were they the wolf warriors of Hengist's day. They were the new chosen people, inheritors of both Roman learning and Germanic courage, destined to spread the gospel to the world. The monasteries became economic powerhouses as well as spiritual centers. Saxon monks were master farmers, turning marginal lands into productive estates. They bred better cattle, developed new crops, and created surplus wealth that funded ever more ambitious artistic projects. At Ely, Abbess Ethelthryth, a Saxon princess who had renounced worldly power for spiritual authority, oversaw workshops that produced jewelry, metalwork, and textiles that amazed visitors from across Europe. How can such beauty emerge from such rough hands? Asked a visiting Frankish bishop, marveling at a golden chalice wrought by Saxon craftsmen. Because, replied Ethelthryth with a smile, our God transforms all things. Even Saxon warhammers can become tools of peace. The transformation wasn't limited to monasteries. In royal courts across England, Saxon culture was blossoming in ways that amazed contemporaries. The great hall of Hrothgar in the poem Beowulf, likely composed during this period, captured the essence of Saxon noble ideals: generosity to followers, courage in battle, and loyalty unto death. But the real Beowulf was more complex than the monster-slaying hero of legend. The poem struggled with questions that haunted Saxon society. How could pagan virtues survive in a Christian world? What happened to the old heroes when new gods demanded different kinds of heroism? The answer came through synthesis. Saxon Christians didn't abandon their ancestral values, they reinterpreted them. Courage in battle became courage in facing temptation. Loyalty to a ring-giving lord became devotion to Christ the King. Generosity with gold became charity to the poor. This fusion created a unique form of Christianity, muscular, heroic, deeply moving to people raised on stories of warrior honor. When Saxon missionaries later carried the gospel to continental Europe, they brought this distinctive interpretation with them. The most famous of these missionaries was Boniface, born Wynfrith in Wessex around 675 AD. Boniface would become known as the Apostle to the Germans, carrying Christianity back to the very lands from which the Saxons had originally come. I go not as conqueror but as servant, Boniface told King Anne of Wessex before departing for the continent. Our ancestors took swords to those lands. I will take only the gospel. Boniface's mission to the Germanic tribes was remarkably successful, partly because he spoke their language, literally and figuratively. He understood Germanic mentality in ways Roman missionaries never could. When he chopped down the sacred oak of Thor at Geismar, he wasn't just destroying a pagan symbol, he was proving that the Christian God was stronger than the old Germanic deities. Back in England, the golden age of learning was producing works that would influence European thought for centuries. Aldhelm of Malmesbury wrote Latin poetry so sophisticated that continental scholars marveled at it. Alcuin of York became Charlemagne's chief educational advisor, helping to design the curriculum that would educate medieval Europe. The period also saw the development of vernacular literature that ranks among the world's greatest. The wanderer and the seafarer poems that captured the Saxon soul's longing for meaning in a temporary world, showed that Germanic poetry could express philosophical depths previously thought impossible in barbarian languages. Where is the horse and, rider, where is the giver of gold? Where are the seats of the feast? Where are the joys of the hall? Alas for the bright cup, alas for the mailed warrior. These lines from The Wanderer capture something essential about the Saxon spirit, a people who had gained much but remembered what they had lost in the gaining. The monasteries also preserved something precious, the old stories. While Saxon warriors were converting to Christianity, Saxon monks were carefully copying down the ancient tales of gods and heroes. They knew these stories were more than entertainment. They were the soul of their people, the dreams that had sustained them through centuries of hardship. A monk at Canterbury, carefully transcribing a tale of Woden's ravens, paused in his work and wrote in the margin, "These were the stories our fathers told before Christ's light came to us. Though we worship different gods now, we honor still the courage these tales taught us." By 750 AD, Saxon England had become the intellectual center of Northern Europe. Scholars from Ireland, Francia, and even Italy came to study in English monasteries. The barbarians, who had once terrified Roman Britain, were now teaching Latin to continental Europeans. But this golden age carried within it the seeds of future challenges. Success had made the Saxons wealthy, and wealth had made some of them soft. The warrior virtues that had carved kingdoms from chaos were giving way to scholarly pursuits and artistic refinement. From across the North Sea, newer barbarians were watching with hungry eyes. From the marriage of Saxon warrior culture and Christian scholarship emerged one of history's most unexpected golden ages. In monasteries scattered across the English landscape, Saxon monks were creating works of art and learning that would be treasured for 1,000 years. The transformation began in the most unlikely place, the windswept island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria. Here, Irish monks had established a monastery that would become the jewel of European scholarship. But it was Saxon hands that would craft its greatest treasure. Brother Edfrith, a Saxon monk whose calligraphy was said to rival the angels themselves, labored for years on a single book, the Lindisfarne Gospels. Working by candlelight in his cold scriptorium, he created illuminated pages that seemed to glow with inner fire. Saxon interlace patterns danced around Latin text, creating a harmony between Germanic art and Christian faith that had never been seen before. "Each letter is a prayer," Edfrith told his fellow monks. "Each page, a sermon in gold and crimson." The Lindisfarne Gospels were more than beautiful. They were revolutionary. Here was proof that Saxon culture could create works to rival anything produced in Rome or Constantinople. The Germanic peoples, once dismissed as barbarians, had become custodians of civilization itself. But Lindisfarne was just the beginning. Across England, Saxon monasteries became centers of learning that drew scholars from across Europe. At Jarrow and Wearmouth, twin monasteries in Northumbria, a young Saxon monk named Bede was writing works that would reshape how people understood history itself. Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People was the first work to use what we now call Anno Domini dating, years measured from Christ's birth. But more than that, it presented a vision of the Saxons not as conquerors or invaders, but as God's chosen instruments for bringing Christianity to Britain. The Saxons came not as destroyers, but as builders, Bede wrote. What seemed like conquest was actually providence, preparing this island to become a beacon of faith to all nations. This was Saxon identity transformed. No longer were they the wolf warriors of Hengist's day. They were the new chosen people, inheritors of both Roman learning and Germanic courage, destined to spread the gospel to the world. The monasteries became economic powerhouses as well as spiritual centers. Saxon monks were master farmers turning marginal lands into productive estates. They bred better cattle, developed new crops, and created surplus wealth that funded ever more ambitious artistic projects. At Ely, Abbess Ethelthryth, a Saxon princess who had renounced worldly power for spiritual authority, oversaw workshops that produced jewelry, metalwork, and textiles that amazed visitors from across Europe. How can such beauty emerge from such rough hands? Asked a visiting Frankish bishop, marveling at a golden chalice wrought by Saxon craftsmen. Because, replied Ethelthryth with a smile, our God transforms all things. Even Saxon war hammers can become tools of peace. The transformation wasn't limited to monasteries. In royal courts across England, Saxon culture was blossoming in ways that amazed contemporaries. The Great Hall of Hrothgar in the poem Beowulf, likely composed during this period, captured the essence of Saxon noble ideals: generosity to followers, courage in battle, and loyalty unto death. But the real Beowulf was more complex than the monster-slaying hero of legend. The poem struggled with questions that haunted Saxon society. How could pagan virtue survive in a Christian world? What happened to the old heroes when new gods demanded different kinds of heroism? The answer came through synthesis. Saxon Christians didn't abandon their ancestral values, they reinterpreted them. Courage in battle became courage in facing temptation. Loyalty to a ring-giving lord became devotion to Christ the King. Generosity with gold became charity to the poor. This fusion created a unique form of Christianity, muscular, heroic, deeply moving to people raised on stories of warrior honor. When Saxon missionaries later carried the gospel to continental Europe, they brought this distinctive interpretation with them. The most famous of these missionaries was Boniface, born Winfrith in Wessex around 675 AD. Boniface would become known as the Apostle to the Germans, carrying Christianity back to the very lands from which the Saxons had originally come. I go not as conqueror but as servant, Boniface told King Ine of Wessex before departing for the continent. Our ancestors took swords to those lands. I will take only the gospel. Boniface's mission to the Germanic tribes was remarkably successful, partly because he spoke their language, literally and figuratively. He understood Germanic mentality in ways Roman missionaries never could. When he chopped down the sacred oak of Thor at Geismar, he wasn't just destroying a pagan symbol, he was proving that the Christian God was stronger than the old Germanic deities. Back in England, the golden age of learning was producing works that would influence European thought for centuries. Aldhelm of Malmesbury wrote Latin poetry so sophisticated that continental scholars marveled at it. Alcuin of York became Charlemagne's chief educational advisor, helping to design the curriculum that would educate medieval Europe. The period also saw the development of vernacular literature that ranks among the world's greatest. The Wanderer and The Seafarer, poems that captured the Saxon soul's longing for meaning in a temporary world, showed that Germanic poetry could express philosophical depths previously thought impossible in barbarian languages. Where is the horse and rider? Where is the giver of gold? Where are the seats of the feast? Where are the joys of the hall? Alas for the bright cup! Alas for the mailed warrior! These lines from The Wanderer capture something essential about the Saxon spirit. A people who had gained much but remembered what they had lost in the gaining. The monasteries also preserved something precious: the old stories. While Saxon warriors were converting to Christianity, Saxon monks were carefully copying down the ancient tales of gods and heroes. They knew these stories were more than entertainment. They were the soul of their people, the dreams that had sustained them through centuries of hardship. A monk at Canterbury, carefully transcribing a tale of Woden's ravens, paused in his work and wrote in the margin, "These were the stories our fathers told before Christ's light came to us. Though we worship different gods now, we honor still the courage these tales taught us." By 750 AD, Saxon England had become the intellectual center of Northern Europe. Scholars from Ireland, Francia, and even Italy came to study in English monasteries. The barbarians, who had once terrified Roman Britain, were now teaching Latin to continental Europeans. But this golden age carried within it the seeds of future challenges. Success had made the Saxons wealthy, and wealth had made some of them soft. The warrior virtues that had carved kingdoms from chaos were giving way to scholarly pursuits and artistic refinement. From across the North Sea, newer barbarians were watching with hungry eyes. The attack came without warning on a peaceful June morning in 793 AD. The monks of Lindisfarne were preparing for morning prayers when dragon-prowed ships appeared through the coastal mist like nightmares made manifest. The Vikings had arrived, and the golden age of Saxon learning was about to face its greatest test. Brother Higbald, keeper of the monastery's precious manuscripts, heard the war cries first, wild, ululating sounds that chilled his blood. "Vikings," he whispered, the word barely audible in the dawn stillness. The raiders struck with the fury of a North Sea storm. These weren't the relatively civilized Saxons of old, who had at least sought to rule what they conquered. These were pure predators, interested only in gold, silver, and slaves. "Please," the elderly Abbot Bede pleaded as a towering Viking warrior approached the altar, battle axe gleaming in the candlelight. "This is God's house. Show mercy." The Viking's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "Your God should have protected you better, monk." What followed was slaughter and sacrilege that shocked Christian Europe. Monks were butchered at their prayers. Precious manuscripts, works that had taken decades to create, were burned for warmth or torn apart in search of hidden gold. 3. Lindisfarne Gospels themselves barely escaped, hidden by quick-thinking brothers who would later smuggle them to safety. News of Lindisfarne's destruction spread across England like wildfire. Alcuin, the great Saxon scholar then serving at Charlemagne's court, wrote in anguish, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. They have desecrated God's sanctuary, shed the blood of saints, and made the house of our hope the place of our despair." But this was only the beginning. The Vikings, mostly Danes and Norwegians seeking wealth and land, found Saxon England rich and tempting. Centuries of peace and prosperity had made many kingdoms complacent. Where once every Saxon man was a warrior, by necessity, now many were farmers, craftsmen, and scholars who barely remembered how to hold a sword. The Viking strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. They would appear suddenly from the sea, strike at the wealthiest targets, and vanish before organized resistance could form. Their ships, shallow-drafted and swift, could penetrate far inland via rivers, bringing destruction to communities that thought themselves safely distant from the coast. King Beorhtric of Wessex learned this lesson tragically when Viking raiders sailed up the Thames and struck at royal estates barely 50 miles from Winchester. The attack was so swift that the first the king knew of it was when refugees began streaming into his capital. "How many ships?" Beorhtric demanded of a bleeding messenger. "Hundreds, my lord. Maybe thousands." The river was black with them. But it wasn't just numbers that made the Vikings so devastating. It was their return to pure warrior culture. While the Saxons had grown civilized, developing laws, literature, and learning, the Vikings had remained what the Saxons once were. Eichkau, people for whom war was both art and religion. Their gods reflected this martial focus. Thor the Thunder wielding his mighty hammer Mjolnir. Odin the All-Father, gathering the bravest dead for the final battle of Ragnarok. Tyr the One-Handed, who sacrificed his sword arm to bind the wolf Fenrir. These were deities who demanded courage above all else. Viking warriors who died bravely in battle could expect to feast in Valhalla until the end of the world. This belief made them incredibly dangerous opponents. They literally did not fear death, seeing it as a doorway to eternal glory. "Today is a good day to die," was their battle cry, and they meant it. The Saxon response was initially fragmented and ineffective. Each kingdom tried to defend itself, but the Vikings were too mobile, too unpredictable. When Saxon forces gathered to protect one target, the raiders would strike somewhere else entirely. King Aella of Northumbria assembled a great host to drive the Vikings from York, only to discover they had already departed, taking with them the entire royal treasury and most of the city's craftsmen as slaves. "They fight like ghosts," complained one frustrated Saxon Than. "How do you defeat an enemy who won't stand and fight?" The Vikings also brought new methods of warfare that the Saxons struggled to counter. The famous shield wall, a line of overlapping shields that had dominated Germanic warfare for centuries, proved vulnerable to Viking berserkers who would work themselves into battle frenzy and charge seemingly without regard for their own safety. At the Battle of Ashdown in 871, Saxon forces watched in horror as a lone Viking berserker, foaming at the mouth and howling like a wolf, smashed through their shield wall and killed a dozen men before finally being brought down. They don't fight like men, reported one Saxon survivor. They fight like wild beasts or demons. The psychological impact was devastating. Saxon England, which had seen itself as the height of Christian civilization, was being humbled by pagans who seemed to come from another age entirely. But the Vikings brought more than just destruction. They were also traders, explorers, and settlers who would eventually transform Saxon England in ways no one could predict. In the markets of York, once a center of Christian learning, Viking merchants sold amber from the Baltic, silk from Constantinople, and silver from as far away as Central Asia. The city, renamed Jorvik by its new rulers, became more cosmopolitan than it had ever been under Saxon control. A Saxon merchant, visiting Jorvik in 865, wrote to his brother, "This place has changed beyond recognition. In the space where once Brother Alcuin taught Latin to Saxon nobles, now Danish traders bargain in a dozen tongues. I heard Arabic, Greek, and languages I cannot name. The pagans have made this city rich, but they have made it foreign too." The Shiu. Vikings also brought new blood to Saxon England. Unlike the earlier Saxon invasions, which had largely displaced the existing population, the Vikings often settled among the Saxons, intermarrying and creating communities that blended both cultures. In these mixed settlements, Saxon and Danish children played together, learned each other's languages, and gradually created something new, a Norse-influenced Saxon culture that would eventually produce some of medieval literature's greatest works. But in the 860s, all this lay in the future. What mattered then was survival, and the Saxons were losing the battle for their homeland. It was into this crisis that a young Prince of Wessex would step, a prince who would earn the title Great and become the only English king to bear that name. But in 871, Alfred was just another royal son fleeing Viking raiders, wondering if Saxon England had a future at all. The darkest hour was approaching. The young prince crouched in the Somerset marshes, watching smoke rise from burning villages across the horizon. Saxon England was dying, and Alfred of Wessex, barely 22 years old, seemed powerless to stop it. It was the winter of 878 AD, and the great heathen army had conquered most of England. Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia had fallen. Only Wessex remained, and even there, Danish kings ruled from captured strongholds. Alfred, once heir to a kingdom, was now a fugitive hiding in the wetlands of Athelney. "My lord," whispered Ethelnoth, his most faithful retainer, as they huddled around a meager fire. "Perhaps it's time to consider terms with the Danes. Many good men have made peace with them." Alfred's eyes reflected the firelight as he stared into the flames. The weight of his people's suffering pressed down on him like a physical burden. And what terms would they offer? To rule as their puppet? To watch them turn our churches into stables for their horses? His voice hardened. "No, Ethelnoth. Better to die as Saxons than live as Danish thralls." But Alfred was more than just another stubborn king refusing to yield. Even in these dark hours, his mind was working, planning, adapting. The traditional Saxon way of warfare, great armies meeting in set battles, had failed repeatedly against Viking raiders. What was needed was something new. The legend tells us that while hiding at Athelney, Alfred was given shelter by a poor swineherd's wife who didn't recognize him. Left to watch her cakes baking, he let them burn while lost in thought about military strategy. When she scolded him for his carelessness, he accepted her rebuke humbly. "Even a king must learn," he reportedly told his companions later, "and sometimes wisdom comes from the humblest sources." Whether true or legend, the story captures something essential about Alfred: his willingness to learn from anyone, his understanding that kingship meant service, not just power. The turning point came in the spring of 878. Alfred's scouts brought word that Guthrum, the Danish king, had settled his army at Chippenham for the season, confident that Saxon resistance was broken. "They think we're finished," Alfred told his war council, a grim smile playing at his lips. "Perhaps it's time we proved them wrong." What followed was one of history's most brilliant guerrilla campaigns. Alfred's forces, moving through terrain they knew like the backs of their hands, struck Danish camps and supply lines with devastating effect. They appeared from morning mists, struck like lightning, and vanished before the enemy could respond. The psychological impact was enormous. Danes who had grown comfortable as occupiers suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders constantly. Saxon peasants who had begun to accept Danish rule started to hope again. "The king lives," became the whisper that ran through Saxon villages. Alfred fights still. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Edington in May 878. Alfred had managed to gather the largest Saxon army seen in years, not just professional warriors, but farmers and craftsmen, who came carrying whatever weapons they could find. Before the battle, Alfred addressed his men in words that would echo through history. "Today we fight not just for victory, but for survival. Not just for Wessex, but for what it means to be Saxon. Behind us lie our homes, our families, our God. Before us stand those who would take all we hold dear. Let them come." The battle raged from dawn to dusk. Danish axes clashed against Saxon, shields in combat so fierce that chroniclers compared it to the gods' final battle at Ragnarok. But there was something different about the Saxon line that day, a desperation that had hardened into determination, a fury refined into purpose. When Guthrum's standard finally fell and the Danish line broke, the cheers of Saxon victory could be heard for miles. But Alfred's greatest triumph came not in battle, but in its aftermath. Instead of slaughtering his defeated enemies, as they would certainly have done to him, Alfred offered terms that astonished everyone. The Treaty of Wedmore established the I.C. Danelaw, partitioning England between Saxon and Danish territories. More remarkably, it required Guthrum to accept Christian baptism. "You fought like a king," Alfred told Guthrum during the baptismal ceremony, placing his own hands on the Danish leader's shoulders. "Now learn to rule like a Christian." The treaty marked the beginning of Alfred's true greatness. With breathing space secured, he set about transforming Saxon society to ensure it could never again be brought so close to extinction. He began with military reform. The old Saxon system, where farmers were called up for brief campaigns before returning to their fields, couldn't cope with professional Viking armies. Alfred created a new system where half his forces remained on active duty, while the other half tended their lands, rotating regularly. He also revolutionized Saxon defenses by building a network of fortified towns called burhs. These weren't just military strongholds, but economic centers where craftsmen and merchants could work under protection. Each burh was positioned so that no Saxon settlement was more than 20 miles from safety. "A kingdom is only as strong as its weakest village," Alfred declared. "We must make every Saxon home a fortress, every Saxon town a bulwark." But Alfred's greatest innovation was educational. He recognized that Saxon culture had nearly died not just from military defeat, but from intellectual decay. Too few Saxons could read Latin. Too many ancient texts were crumbling unread in monastery libraries. Alfred personally translated works by Gregory the Great, Boethius, and Orosius from Latin into Anglo-Saxon, making classical learning accessible to his people. He established schools where young nobles learned to read and write in their own language as well as Latin. "A king without learning is like a ship without a compass," he wrote in the preface to his translation of Gregory's Pastoral Care. "He may sail far, but he will never reach safe harbor." Perhaps most remarkably, Alfred began compiling the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a year-by-year record of English history written in the vernacular. This wasn't just record-keeping, but a conscious effort to create Saxon identity, to remind his people who they were, where they came from, and what they had achieved. The Chronicle's entry for 878 reads simply, "This year the army went secretly in midwinter after 12th night to Chippenham, and rode over Wessex and settled there, and drove many of the people over sea, and of the remainder the greater part they reduced to submission except Alfred the king." But then it adds, "And afterwards at Easter, King Alfred with a little band made a fortress at Athelney, and from that fortress with the Thanes of Somerset who came to him, he continued fighting against the army." The understated prose conceals one of history's most remarkable comebacks. By his death in 899, Alfred had transformed Wessex from a dying kingdom into the strongest power in Britain. His son Edward and grandson Athelstan would use the foundations he laid to reconquer the Danelaw and create the Kingdom of England. But Alfred's true greatness lay not in conquest, but in understanding that lasting victory comes from building something worth defending. He created institutions that would outlive him, ideas that would inspire generations, and most importantly, a sense of Saxon identity strong enough to absorb even Danish Vikings and make them English. "I have always tried," he wrote near the end of his life, "to live worthily while I lived, and after my death to leave to those who come after me my memory in good works." He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Alfred's death in 899 might have seemed like the end of Saxon resurgence, but it was actually the beginning of England's birth. His son Edward and daughter Ethelflaed would prove that the House of Wessex had produced not one great ruler, but a dynasty of them. Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, was perhaps the most remarkable woman of the age. While her brother Edward secured Wessex's borders, she led Mercian armies against Danish strongholds with a skill that amazed friend and foe alike. "She fights like a man, but thinks like a woman," observed a Danish captive after the Battle of Derby. "She sees things others miss." What Ethelflaed saw was that reconquest wasn't just about military victory. It was about convincing Danes and Saxons alike that they could share a common identity. In captured territories, she rebuilt churches, but also allowed Danish settlers to keep their laws. She appointed Saxon and Danish nobles to joint positions, creating a government that drew from both traditions. "We are no longer Saxons conquering Danes," she told her war council, "but English liberating England." That word, English, was new, revolutionary. It implied not a tribal identity, but a territorial one. You could be English regardless of whether your grandfather had been Saxon, Danish, or British. What mattered was loyalty to the land and its laws. Edward the Elder, meanwhile, was systematically reducing Danish strongholds throughout the Midlands. His strategy was patient but relentless, siege warfare combined with diplomatic isolation that left Danish kings with no choice but submission. The campaign reached its climax at the Siege of Bedford in 915. The Danish garrison, commanded by a veteran named Hakon, who had fought at Edington 37 years earlier, held out for months against Saxon forces. "Why do you resist so fiercely?" Edward called out during a truce negotiation. "Your cause is lost. Your allies have submitted. What do you gain by prolonging this?" Hakon's reply revealed the complexity of the age. "I resist because I am Danish, Your Majesty. But my sons born in this land speak Saxon as well as Danish. They call themselves English. Perhaps I fight so that they may have something to surrender." When Bedford finally fell, Edward's treatment of the defeated garrison set the pattern for English expansion. Hakon was offered lands in East Anglia if he swore loyalty to the crown. His sons were invited to court, where they received education alongside Saxon nobles. Within a generation, their families had intermarried with Saxon nobility. The pattern was repeated across the reconquered territories. Danish military leaders became English thanes. Danish farmers became English freeholders. Danish customs were absorbed into English law. This wasn't conquest in the old sense, it was evolution. By 927, Alfred's grandson Athelstan had completed the work his family had begun. At the Battle of Brunanburh, he defeated a coalition of Scots, Welsh, and Dublin Vikings so decisively that no foreign power would seriously threaten English independence for generations. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's entry for that year rings with triumph. "Never yet on this island, as books tell us and our old sages, was a greater slaughter of an army made by the edge of the sword. Since the Angles and Saxons came up over the broad seas from the east, sought Britain, overcame the Welsh, and won the land." But Athelstan's greatest achievement wasn't military. It was constitutional. He was the first ruler to style himself King of all Britain and mean it. His court brought together Welsh princes, Scottish kings, and Irish nobles as vassals who acknowledged English supremacy while maintaining their own traditions. "I rule not as conqueror, but as father," Athelstan declared at his coronation. "All who acknowledge English law shall have English protection." This principle would define England for centuries to come. Unlike other medieval kingdoms that remained ethnically homogeneous, England became a melting pot where different peoples gradually merged into something new. The process wasn't always smooth. Edgar the Peaceful, 959–975, faced rebellions from both Saxon traditionalists who resented Danish influence and Danish separatists who chafed under Saxon rule. His solution was characteristic of English pragmatism. He established different legal codes for different regions while maintaining unified royal authority. "Let the Danes of Yorkshire live by Danish law," he declared, "and the Saxons of Wessex by Saxon law. But let all live under English rule." This decentralized approach allowed England to absorb diversity while maintaining unity, a balance that would prove crucial in years to come. The late Saxon period also saw remarkable cultural flowering. The poem Beowulf, though telling ancient Germanic stories, was written down during this era and reflects the mature Saxon understanding of heroism, duty, and tragedy. Its hero is a Geat who serves a Danish king, a perfect metaphor for the ethnic mixing that had created England. Saxon architecture reached new heights during this period. Churches like those at Bradford-on-Avon and Sompting combined Germanic structural techniques with Mediterranean decorative elements, creating a distinctive English style that influenced European building for centuries. But perhaps most importantly, the late Saxon kings created institutions that would outlive their dynasty. The Witan, a council of nobles that advised the king, became the foundation for later parliamentary government. The shire system, which divided England into administrative counties, provided local government that remained remarkably stable for nearly 1,000 years. Saxon law, too, evolved into something distinctively English. The principle that law came, not from royal decree but from ancient custom, refined by royal courts, would later influence the development of common law and constitutional monarchy. King Ethelred, the Unready, 978–1016, tested these institutions to their limits when Viking raids resumed with unprecedented ferocity. But even his reign, often seen as a period of failure, demonstrated the strength of what his predecessors had built. When Sweyn Forkbeard and later his son Canute conquered England, they ruled as English kings, not Danish conquerors. Canute's laws were written in English, his court followed English customs, and his successors were raised as English princes. "Though I am Danish by birth," Canute proclaimed, "I am English by God's grace and your loyalty." The ultimate test of English identity came with Edward the Confessor, 1042–1066, whose reign marked both the culmination and end of Saxon England. Half Norman by birth, raised in exile at the French court, Edward nonetheless ruled as an English king committed to English traditions. His court was cosmopolitan in ways that would have amazed earlier Saxon kings. Norman nobles served alongside Danish jarls and Saxon thanes. French, Latin, and English were all heard in the royal presence chamber. Yet the kingdom they served was unmistakably English. When Edward died childless in January 1066, the succession crisis that followed revealed both the strength and weakness of the English system. 3 claimants, Harold Godwinson, Saxon, Harold Hardrada, Norwegian, and William of Normandy, Norman, all had legitimate claims under English law. The battles that decided England's fate at Stamford Bridge and Hastings were fought by armies that perfectly represented what England had become. Harold's forces included Saxons, Danes, Welsh, and even some Normans. His enemies were equally mixed coalitions. When Harold fell at Hastings with an arrow through his eye, Saxon political dominance ended. But English identity, that remarkable fusion of peoples, customs, and institutions that the Saxons had created, proved indestructible. The Normans would rule England, but within generations they would become English themselves, just as the Danes had before them. The Saxon achievement was complete. They had created something stronger than any kingdom, more enduring than any dynasty. They had created a people. The arrow that pierced Harold's eye at Hastings on October 14, 1066, marked more than the death of a king. It ended Saxon political rule forever. But as the Norman knights charged across the bloody field, they were conquering a land that would ultimately conquer them. William the Conqueror's victory was total and devastating. In a single day's battle, Saxon England lost not just its king, but virtually its entire noble class. The flower of Saxon manhood lay dead around Harold's fallen banner, their golden dragon standards trampled in the mud. God has judged between us, William declared as he surveyed the carnage, his mail shirt still spattered with Saxon blood. England is mine by right of conquest, but conquest and rule proved very different things. William's first years were a nightmare of rebellion and repression. The Saxons, who had submitted to Danish kings and absorbed Viking settlers, found Norman rule far less palatable. The Normans weren't seeking to become English. They intended to remake England in their own image. The harrying of the North, at 1069-70, revealed the terrible cost of Saxon resistance. When Yorkshire rose in rebellion, William's response was systematic devastation. His armies burned villages, slaughtered livestock, and salted fields until nothing lived between York and Durham. An eyewitness chronicler wrote, "It was horrible to behold human corpses rotting in the houses, on the roads, and in the fields. For no village remained inhabited between York and Durham, and they lay desolate for 9 years. Yet even in this darkest hour, Saxon culture showed its resilience. Refugees from the devastated north carried their stories, laws, and traditions to other parts of England, where Saxon communities preserved them like sacred flames. In the monasteries, Saxon monks carefully hid their precious manuscripts. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle continued to be written, though now its entries reflected the grief of a conquered people. And all the English nation was in great anguish because of their sins. But the Chronicle also recorded something remarkable: Norman knights beginning to learn English, marrying Saxon women, and adopting Saxon customs. The conquerors were slowly being absorbed by the conquered. This transformation was embodied in William's own family. His son Henry I married Matilda, a Saxon princess descended from Alfred the Great. Their wedding was seen by Saxons as a restoration of the ancient royal line, while Normans grumbled about their king going native. Henry understood what many of his Norman nobles didn't, that to rule England effectively one had to become English. His court blended Norman efficiency with Saxon traditions. His laws, while written in Latin and French, incorporated Saxon legal principles that his subjects understood and accepted. "I am not Norman king of English subjects," Henry reportedly told his council, "but English king of Norman and Saxon subjects alike." The process of cultural fusion was visible everywhere. Norman castles were built by Saxon masons using techniques that blended both traditions. Norman knights learned Saxon hunting laws and woodcraft. Saxon nobles who survived the conquest sent their sons to Norman schools, where they learned to fight on horseback and speak French. Most remarkably, the Saxon language proved indestructible. Despite Norman attempts to make French the language of court and government, English persisted in village and marketplace. Saxon stories told around peasant fires gradually influenced Norman literature. Saxon words crept into Norman French, while Norman vocabulary enriched Saxon English. By the reign of Henry II, 1154–1189, this linguistic fusion had created something new, Middle English. It was neither pure Saxon nor pure Norman, but a hybrid that combined the earthiness of Germanic roots with the sophistication of Latin vocabulary. The epic poem Liamund's Brut, written around 1200, perfectly exemplifies this transformation. Written in Middle English by a Saxon priest, it tells the story of British kings from Brutus to Cadwallader, but its hero is Arthur, and its values are chivalric. Saxon literary technique had absorbed Norman romantic ideals to create something unprecedented. Saxon institutions proved equally adaptive. The Witan evolved into royal councils where Norman barons sat alongside Saxon thanes. The shire courts continued to function, though now they answered to Norman sheriffs rather than Saxon earls. Most importantly, Saxon legal principles survived and eventually conquered Norman jurisprudence. Henry II's legal reforms, which created the common law system that still governs England today, were based largely on Saxon precedents. The jury system, trial by ordeal's replacement with trial by peers, and the principle that custom had the force of law, all had Saxon roots. "We have conquered England," one Norman chronicler observed around 1150. "But England has conquered us." The final proof came with the anarchy, 1135–1153, the civil war between Stephen and Matilda for Henry III's succession. Both sides appealed not to Norman law, but to Saxon precedent. Matilda's claim rested on her descent from Saxon kings, Stephen's on Saxon principles of elected kingship. When Henry II finally established the Plantagenet dynasty, he ruled as an English king whose power derived from both conquest and consent. His subjects were no longer Normans and Saxons, but simply English, a people whose identity transcended any single ethnic origin. The Saxon story might have ended here, with political defeat transformed into cultural victory. But one final chapter remained to be written, the most poignant of all. In remote parts of England, especially in the northern forests and western hills, Saxon communities maintained their old ways largely unchanged. They still elected their leaders by ancient custom, still followed laws that predated the conquest, still told stories in pure Saxon tongue. These communities produced England's greatest folk hero, Robin Hood. Whether based on a real person or purely legendary, Robin embodied everything the Saxons had been: the defender of ancient right against Norman wrong, the voice of the forest against the voice of the court, the representative of a free people against foreign oppression. Robin's stories, told in Middle English but preserving Saxon values, spread across England and beyond. They offered both entertainment and resistance, a way for common people to maintain Saxon ideals in a Norman world. A Saxon yeoman who fears neither Norman knight nor sheriff's writ. This was how early ballads described Robin. He became the eternal Saxon, living forever in the greenwood, defending the poor and defying tyrants. By 1200, the transformation was complete. The last Saxon earls had died or been absorbed into the Norman nobility. The last Saxon rebels had submitted or been crushed. The Saxon kingdom was gone forever. But Saxon England lived on in the laws that governed Norman knights, the language that evolved into Shakespearean English, the institutions that would one day produce Parliament, and the stories that still inspire anyone who dreams of justice, freedom, and resistance to oppression. The dragons had not died. They had become phoenix, rising from their own ashes to create something greater than what had been lost. And so we reach the end of our journey through Saxon time, from the mist-shrouded shores where Hengist first landed to the smoke-covered battlefield where Harold fell. 12 centuries of triumph and tragedy, of kingdoms rising and falling like waves upon some eternal shore. Close your eyes one final time and see them as they were. The wolf warriors sailing across gray seas toward unknown destinies. The scholar monks illuminating manuscripts by candlelight, preserving wisdom for ages yet unborn. The kings and queens who forged a nation from warring tribes. The common people who cleared forests, built villages, and created the foundations of civilization itself. They called themselves Saxons, but they became something greater. They took a Roman province and made it England. They absorbed Vikings and were absorbed by Normans, but through it all maintained an identity that was uniquely their own. Their language lives on in every word you speak. Their laws echo in every court of justice. Their stories inspire every tale of heroism against impossible odds. Their dream of freedom under law became the foundation of democracy itself. The Saxon achievement was this: they proved that a people's spirit is stronger than any sword, more enduring than any kingdom, more precious than any crown. They showed that identity comes not from blood alone, but from shared values, common dreams, and the courage to defend what matters most. In the end, the Saxons did not merely make history, they became it. They are in the oak trees they planted, the churches they built, the songs they sang. They are in the very soil of England, in the dreams of its people, in the hope that justice will triumph and freedom endure. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember them. Remember the long ships cutting through morning mist, the great halls where heroes feasted, the quiet monasteries where wisdom was preserved. Remember that you are their inheritors, carrying forward the torch they lit so long ago. For the Saxon story never truly ends. It lives on in all who believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That right makes might, and that no defeat is final as long as the spirit remains unbroken. The dragons sleep, but they dream still. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. The Saxon legacy continues in every voice that speaks for justice, every hand that builds rather than destroys, every heart that chooses hope over despair. Their story is our story, and it's far from over.